Okay.
Great to see everyone.
Okay, I think it's the top of the hour now. We don't want to waste any time. So good morning from my side. No, it's actually afternoon. It's 12 p.m. and good evening from everywhere you are. I hope everyone is doing good. So today we have a distinguished guest. I want to introduce His Excellency David Angell, who is a Canadian representative to Canada. I will share the screen for his bio. I'll read his bio on the screen so that everyone can see it. Yes. So
mostly that just shows that I'm very old, Enoch.
No, yeah. So Mr. David Angell, political science from Yale University, which was in 1986. He also holds a master's in political science at the University of Toronto, 1987, at the school I go to. Also holds a bachelor in international relations at the University of Cambridge. So he's currently an ambassador and a permanent representative of Canada at North Atlantic Council. He also served as Assistant Secretary to the Cabinet, Foreign and Defense Policy at the Privy Council Office from 2016 to 2019. He has also served as a High Commissioner to Kenya, 2012 to 2016. Those on the group from Kenya, he was there in your country. He has also served as a Director General for International Organization, Human Rights and Democracy, from 2009 to 2012. He's also served as for international organizations 2008 to 2009 and representing Africa from 2007 to 2008. He also served as a High Commissioner to Nigeria between 2004 to 2007. Mr. Angell was also G8 Deputy Personal Representative 2001 to 2004 and a Personal Representative 2007 to 2012 for Africa. He was also a principal organizer of the 2002 and 2010 G8 summits that were held in Kanasakis and Mokosa, I guess that's Japan. He also served as the United Nations at the United Nations between 1996 to 2001, including as alternate representative on the United Nations Security Council in 1999 to 2000. Before that, he was also advisor to the General John Dichelstein on international body on the commissioning of arms, 1995, and the multi-party negotiation in Northern Ireland, 1996. Mr. Angell has also served at the embassy in Washington, D.C. between 1981 to 1993. He's also a recipient of Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee 2013. So join me and we welcome His Excellency David Angell.
You're welcome.
Thank you all very much. And Enoch, thank you for the introduction and for the chance to speak with your colleagues. And thank you, all of you, for joining in and for your interest in diplomacy. If you agree, I'll speak for 20, 25 minutes, talk a little bit about diplomacy and leadership. And then we can spend most of the time on questions. But I'm really pleased at your interest and very pleased that as you look at leadership through different lenses, through this series of interactions, that I'm very pleased that one of those lenses is diplomacy. I'm going to focus my comments on the bit of diplomacy that people tend to think about, which is representation abroad. But it's useful to remember that, diplomats do other things too. We spend about half of our careers abroad, but we spend about half of our careers in our capitals as home civil servants working on foreign policy issues. And we also spend a large amount of time simply as administrators. So it's not always discussion and consideration of foreign policy. The administration part is important, and I'll just touch on it and the Home Office bit very briefly. But when you think about it, when we're abroad, if you're managing a large embassy, you're managing an office of the government abroad, at which you may have 5, 6, 7, 8 home departments represented. The Defense Ministry might be there, the Agriculture Ministry, the Intelligence Service possibly. In many countries, the Aid Ministry is separate from the Foreign Ministry, and the Trade Ministry may be separate. So you're kind of the conductor, but also the administrator, making sure that the machine actually functions. And the home civil service part is important as well, because at the end of the day, people you think about as diplomats when they're abroad are the folk who at home are providing the advice to the government on foreign policy issues and providing ideas on how the government's international objectives can be taken forward. The bit of diplomacy that everyone thinks about, the representation abroad, kind of has three main aspects. If you leave aside the sort of the pure representation bit. One is the management of the bilateral relationship or the membership in an international organization. And what that means is you're kind of the manager for the overall relationship, both when it's working and you're providing ideas on how to strengthen it, but also when it's not working and you're figuring out how you can advise the government to get yourself and your country out of whatever hole you managed to put yourself in. A second part is you are the main advisor to the government on how to take forward any foreign policy objectives that relate to the country you're in. Part of that can mean simply delivering the initiative in the country, but part of that can involve some very creative heavy lifting, figuring out how what the government is trying to do can be made relevant to the country that you're in or the countries you're accredited to. And then a third part of what one does as a diplomat, in a second I'm going to have to get up to let my dog in, so sorry about that. She's peering at me through the garden window. A third part of what we do is manage big complex initiatives. Governments have objectives domestically and internationally. Sometimes they only have a general idea what it is they want to accomplish. And then the diplomats in the field, working with colleagues at home, have to put flesh on the bones and figure out, sorry, the dog's jumping at the window, 1 minute. And so you put the flesh on the bones and figure out how the objective can be accomplished. And I'm going to spend about 5-10 minutes talking about 4 examples. And then I'll swing back to those and link them to some of the leadership traits. My dog's going crazy around my feet now. Some of the leadership traits that diplomats need to demonstrate. So one example, Enoch mentioned that I'd been involved in the Northern Ireland peace process. And so to use that as a lens through which to give an example of what the work of diplomats can involve. In this case, the British government got into a little bit of difficulty around a very specific issue relating to Northern Ireland. The cabinet minister responsible for Northern Ireland had made a statement in the British House of Commons relating to the sequence through which the arms that terrorist groups in Northern Ireland were using could be decommissioned. In other words, could be taken out of commission. And that created a bit of a crisis in the British and Irish management of Northern Ireland and the related issues. And so the two governments, in order to solve this dilemma, invited in 3 partners, the US, Canada, and Finland, to help disentangle what was at the time just a decommissioning issue. And so they invited George Mitchell, who was the president of the Senate in the United States, John de Chastelin, who was my boss, who was the chief of defense staff, our senior most soldier, and Harry Holkeri, who was the president of Finland, and asked them to take on a 2-month assignment to provide advice to the two governments on how terrorist weapons could be taken off the street. And so the three principals and their four advisors, myself, a Finn, and two Americans, were given the task of meeting with anybody we wanted to in Northern Ireland, or indeed in mainland UK or in Ireland, to get ideas on how decommissioning could be addressed in a way that would be acceptable to all the parties in the, at that point, 2-generation-long conflict in Northern Ireland. And we met with, through formal hearings, with former terrorists, with former soldiers, active soldiers, members of the different governments, the relatives of individuals who had been killed in the terror over a period of 2 or 3 decades. And over the 2-month period, we put together a report for the governments on how the weapons could be taken out. And then, somewhat to our surprise, we were then asked to come back. There was a sense on the part of the two governments that enough progress was being made that a comprehensive peace process could be attempted in Northern Ireland, really for the first time. And so the three principals, Mitchell, De Shastlin, and Hulkery, were asked to come back to be the independent co-chairs of that process. And that is the process that eventually led to the Good Friday Agreement, which ended the conflict in Northern Ireland. And so, for the purposes of the group and what you're considering over the course of this series, the characteristics that we really needed to bring to bear were the ability to listen really carefully, because everything that we eventually recommended was based on the nuances that we were hearing, because we had to piece together an approach that we thought would be acceptable to groups that were still in conflict. Judgment, and analytical skill. So I'll give you a second example, which relates to the period when Canada was on the UN Security Council in 99-2000. And as you know, there are 5 permanent members, 10 elected members. We were one of the elected members serving a 2-year term. And the practice on the Security Council is that all of the elected members chair one or more of the Security Council's committees. And the committees are the mechanisms through which a lot of the actual work is being done. And my boss at the time, Bob Fowler, was passionate for Africa, had spent part of his career working on issues relating to Africa. He's the reason that I became active on Africa myself. So he wanted a committee for Canada that would be focused on Africa, and he wanted a committee assignment for Canada that would focus on a complex conflict where we thought that real progress could be made by the Security Council. And so we took on the chairmanship of the Security Council's Angola Sanctions Committee. And the council at that point, the Angola Civil War had been going on for about 3 decades at that stage. The Security Council, before we had become a member, had determined that the UNITA rebel force was the principal cause for the continuation of the civil war. And so the Security Council, again, before we were a member, put in place a whole series of sanctions against UNITA on their ability to buy weapons, their ability to make money from petroleum, their ability to make money from diamonds, their ability to travel, their ability to handle finances. But what was clear was that the council, in putting in place all of these sanctions over a period of several years, had not given very much consideration to how they might be made to work, and they weren't being made to work. Most of the councils were ineffectual. And so the task that we took on was figuring out how these various sanctions could be made to work. So again, we were given this kind of blank slate with a committee comprised of the entire membership of the Security Council and the support of the United Nations behind us, but given the task that no one had been able to figure out before, which is how do you actually make these sanctions work? And so we, in this case, we undertook a fair amount of travel to Angola, but also to neighboring countries, also to countries like Belgium, where I am by coincidence now, where part of the diamond trade was centered, And we consulted fairly extensively with industry, with everyone we could to get a firm understanding of what the impediments to making the sanctions work were. And then we put in place a panel of experts, which the council had not done before. In other words, an investigative panel with, I think, 10 members, if I remember correctly. And they were given a mandate on behalf of the United Nations Security Council to do actually fairly dangerous investigative work and to identify how it was that the sanctions were being violated and by whom, and to provide recommendations on what might be done about it. And so we had produced our own recommendations on before that based on travel, but these were more forensic recommendations. And they produced a report that was extraordinarily controversial at the time, that named names. It was controversial in part because some of the names that were named were presidents of countries. And the panel report was almost too hot to handle diplomatically. And so we put in place a second panel of experts appointed differently, not by us, to look again at the same information and to continue the investigative work. And then we put in place a third panel, and all of them produce the same corroborated information. And on the basis of that information, we were able to make it much more difficult for UNITA to rebound when they suffered setbacks on the battlefield, which they were suffering. And there was an active war between the government of Angola and UNITA. And it became more expensive to procure weapons, more difficult for them to fly them in. Their bank accounts were frozen. They weren't making money from diamonds. They weren't making money from petroleum. And eventually they agreed a ceasefire, and they agreed to pursue their objectives through the legitimate political process, which they did. The ceasefire, to my knowledge, was never violated, not once. There was eventually a peace agreement, and UNITA is now a political party that participates in the Angolan democratic process. This is a curtailed version of what happened over several years. But again, the tasks that we had to analyze the situation. There was a degree of risk taking and tolerance for risk. And there was, most of all, there was sort of creative thought and again, listening really carefully to what people were saying to figure out how a course forward could be identified. I'll give you a third example, also from the Security Council, when we were a member. Again, we were a member in 1999, 2000. And so the genocide in Rwanda was only 5 years behind us, and the massacre at Srebrenica in Bosnia was only 4 years behind us. And these were horrific developments that had really tarnished the reputation of the Security Council and threw into question the Council's ability to do its work. In particular, actually in both situations, you had UN peacekeepers deployed who just stood by while civilians were massacred. Our foreign minister at the time, a man called Lloyd Axworthy, had wanted us, his team on the Security Council, to find a way to respond to the atrocious weakness that the Council had demonstrated, and more generally to put the concept of human security on the Council's agenda. And the idea behind human security is that the security of people matters as much as the security of states. And so we developed this initiative on protection of civilians in armed conflict, which was controversial because, you know, if you're China, for example, the concept was sailing a little bit more closer to interference in domestic affairs than China historically is comfortable with. and it was controversial for a variety of reasons. And so we put in place this initiative on protection of civilians. We tried to leverage the 50th anniversary that year of the Geneva Conventions. And we developed the initiative incrementally in a way that allowed us to maintain the support of China and Russia and of other council members that were a bit skeptical. And we first, when we had the council presidency in February of 1999, on our second month on the council, we hosted an open debate of the council. We used that to bring in the Humanitarian Affairs Department. Usually didn't address the Security Council. We brought in the ICRC, we brought in others. And we were able to get through a presidential statement. First of all, we were able to get protection of civilians on the agenda, which requires consensus. And it's been on the agenda ever since. We got agreement on a presidential statement, which tasked the Secretary General to prepare a report on protection of civilians with recommendations. And then over the course of the 2 years, we negotiated the adoption of 2 Security Council resolutions on protection of civilians. And we designed this initiative so that every year there would be a requirement for a report by the Secretary General, a requirement for a response by the Council. And the intention was that we knew there was only so much we'd be able to get done in year 1 or year 2, but this way, by bringing the issue back before the Council year in, year out, year after year, progress would be made incrementally. And that's what's happened. The issue is still on the agenda of the Security Council. A majority of UN peace support operations now have mandates for the protection of civilians. None of them had them at the time. Security Council mandated peace support operations are deployed in such a way that experts on protection of civilians are part of each operation. And we've had a cycle of resolutions now. I think it's more than 12, each of which takes forward what the Council does. And civilians are still enormously at risk. And you only have to look at Yemen and Syria and any number of conflicts to see that. But the conflicts in which peace support operations are deployed have seen a great reduction in civilian casualties. And we've not seen a repetition of the hideous dynamic in Srebrenica, where peace support soldiers, UN soldiers, stood by while civilians were massacred. So progress was made. And again, the traits there, creativity, listening carefully, analytical skill. I'll come back to traits more generally afterwards. But let me give you a fourth example of how I was part of a group that was tasked by the government to take forward an objective that was only very loosely defined, and that we then had to define and flesh out. Canada is a member of the G7, G8. It was the G8 for much of my career, but now with Russia out, it's back to the G7. At the G7, I think maybe it was G8 already. No, at the G8 summit in Genoa back in, I think it was 2000, a number of African leaders, Obasanjo, Wads, Mbeki, Bouteflika, and Meles Zenawi, introduced the G8 leaders to what at the time was called the New African Initiative, and what soon became known as NEPAD, the New Partnership for Africa's Development, which was a very broad, very courageous, and quite comprehensive political and economic reform initiative. And they presented it to African leaders, to G8 leaders, said, this is what we're proposing that our peers in Africa take forward. Do you want to be part of this? And this was the G8 summit in Italy. Canada was due to host the next one in Kananaskis. And our Prime Minister of the day, Jean Chrétien, said yes to the challenge from the 5 African presidents and said that, moreover, it will be the focus of the summit that we host next year. And we're going to put in place a process of involving personal leaders for each of the G8 countries and each of the 5 African countries that authored NEPAD. And these personal representatives of leaders will meet regularly and will devise, and the G8 personal representatives in consultation will devise a G8 response to NEPAD. And the intention or the expectation was that the response would be the centerpiece of the Kananaskis summit the next year. What in fact happened was that this mechanism of personal representatives of G8 and African leaders actually existed for about 10 years. And there were a series of G8 responses to NEPAD, which cumulatively were quite substantial. We developed an Africa action plan in response to NEPAD. Its adoption was a centerpiece of the Kananaskis summit. We put in place a monitoring mechanism so that in partnership with the African personal reps, we could monitor progress and implementation of the commitments. And then we expanded the process through something that was called the Africa Partnership Forum to include a larger group of African countries. In other words, all the countries that were on the 2 tiers of the regional continental leadership of NEPAD, but also a much broader group of development partners. So we broadened the G8 participation to include the Nordics, to include a whole bunch of other European and some Asian partners. And that worked for about 15 years. And if you look at, I mean, NEPAD was about much more than aid, but when the 5 African presidents presented NEPAD at Genoa, cumulative ODA to Africa was diminishing, and that was turned around by NEPAD, and aid increased, but NEPAD was about much more than that. The reform initiatives were supported. African leaders were able to get leverage in their reform ambitions through the partnership. Trade increased, and it had a whole range of consequences. So just to come back to characteristics of diplomacy and some of the traits that were, let me talk about some of the traits first. What I've experienced in my career, there are 7 or 8 traits that I've found to be most important to me as an individual diplomat, but also important professionally in the people I've seen around me. The most important is judgment. And at the end of the day, the diplomat is often put in situations that are complex, where the solutions aren't obvious, where there can be sharp differences of view, often very high stakes if you get it wrong. And so judgment is, I think, by far the most important attribute for success as a diplomat. Analytical ability is important. The common thread in the 4 examples I gave you, and that's why I gave them. The government or the organization had an objective. The path to achieving it was not necessarily obvious, and the task of the diplomat was to figure out how the government could achieve its goal and get from A to B. Linked to that, creativity. Again, the Angola sanctions example. The process resulted not only in making the sanctions work and in bringing an end to what at that time was a 2-decade longer civil war, but the process also spawned the Kimberley process and the global effort to deal with conflict diamonds. And some of the tools that we used in Angola were then applied immediately in the case of Sierra Leone, and diamond revenues were taken out of that conflict as well, and that conflict was brought to an end. A fourth attribute is discipline. At the end of the day, diplomats operate on instruction, and we're not free agents. I don't get to express my view at the NATO Council table. I get to express my government's view. Happily, as a Canadian, I'm almost never in a situation where I disagree with my government. But even if I did disagree with my government, because we tend not to take extreme positions, but even if I did disagree, my job is to communicate the government's view. And so that degree of discipline is important. Ability to communicate is important, and part of that is sensitivity in communicating, and not communicating the same way irrespective of who the audience is. But when I was High Commissioner in Nigeria, I spent a lot of time in the Darfur negotiations that the African Union was chairing that were taking place in Abuja. And when you're talking about Darfur to a bunch of commanders of military groups around the table, you use different language than you're used when you're talking to a Canadian audience that has a much more general understanding of that particular conflict. And when you're talking to the government representatives, different language still. So again, it's clarity of communication, but the ability to target what you're saying to the audience you're speaking to. A fifth characteristic that I would flag is empathy. There's almost never a situation where one side is right, the other side is wrong. Angola was a little bit unusual in that the Security Council had taken formal decisions that UNITA was wrong. But in almost every other circumstance, you got a bit of right and a bit of wrong on all sides. And you need to understand where people are coming from in their own analysis and their own view of the world if you're going to put together a path forward that allows your own objectives to be achieved. And if you're talking about a peace process or something like it, that allows for the reconciliation that you need. A sixth, I think it's seventh now, characteristic is resilience. Most of this is not easy. And being a diplomat and living abroad is not the same thing as traveling abroad. Sometimes just day-to-day life is not easy. Sometimes you're in a situation that might be dangerous. Sometimes you're in a situation where you've got responsibilities that are pulling you in different directions. And so, a seventh characteristic, you need a degree of fortitude and stamina. And if you're doing something like a peace process or something like that, you may be operating on 2 or 3 hours sleep for each day for quite a long time. But then the last trait I would highlight is independence. We operate on instruction, but you need to be self-starting. You need to be able to operate with a fair degree of autonomy and self-discipline. I hope that some of you are considering diplomacy as a career. Mine is, I've been doing this for 30 years and at some point I will retire. It's a career that I've absolutely loved, in part because it's one where you can have an impact that affects people, but it's also one that is enormously stimulating. I've mentioned time in capital, I've mentioned time abroad. It's a rotational career. You move every 2 or 3 years, which is enormously stimulating. It's very hard on the family, but it's enormously stimulating. And it's very deliberate. In some ways, it would be more logical to be left alone for 15 years on a particular area and acquire real expertise. But this kind of weird rotational life that we lead, changing countries every 2 to 3 years, shifting from multilateral responsibilities to bilateral, learning about trade as well as political diplomacy. It's all, there's a method to the madness, and the intention is to give you a diversity of experience so that when eventually you're in a position of responsibility as an ambassador or an assistant deputy minister or what have you, you have been thoroughly prepared through the breadth of things that you've been called upon to do. Enoch, why don't I stop there and answer questions? I think I've ended up talking for much longer than I intended to, so sorry about that, but very happy to answer questions.
No, thank you very much. The examples were so enriching. I like how you first gave like, active examples, and according to those examples and how you gave, these characteristics, stimulating from those examples, of course. Yeah, I would open up to people who have questions. But I have one question for you, actually. My question is, why should young leaders, because these are young leaders and they are leaders in different capacities from their respective countries, why should they embrace diplomacy? Why can't they, go to other careers and to do other stuff? Why should they embrace diplomacy, and how?
It's a very good question, Enoch, and they should embrace diplomacy if this is the type of lifestyle that appeals to them. It's not for everyone, and if they don't want the dislocation and the strain on family that diplomacy involves, then it's not for them. But the value of diplomacy as a career, the world is getting more complicated. I see that in my current job at the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is a political military alliance. The challenges that are confronting governments, whether they're to do with migration or with things economic, things security, they are almost always challenges that are too complex for any government to address on their own. And so diplomacy is increasingly necessary given the increasing complexity. And so if you're young and ambitious and interested in the world and you want to have an impact, and the issues that you're interested in are issues that are too broad for any one government to fix alone, then diplomacy is a good career to look to.
Sorry, I muted myself. I say hi, Nyasha. And Lawrence.
Hello.
Hi.
Is that my chance to speak?
Can just hear you, but not very well.
Hello.
Much better. Hi, Nyasha.
Better.
Hello. Thank you very much. I actually have a kind of like different perspective when it comes to diplomacy. But in my country, and I can attest to some.
Sorry, Nyasha, I don't know whether it's me not getting you correctly, but your voice is kind of in a drum. Can we can't.
Maybe it's my mistake. Let me try again. Maybe.
Or you can type it. I can read it for you if you want. If you don't know.
Okay. Let me type it out.
Okay, perfect. We should go to another person as you type it. Lawrence?
Greetings, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity. Mine is brief. You are really bringing up very, very interesting points. Mine has to do with negotiation. How critical is negotiation needed, especially in diplomacy? Because while you were narrating the stories of trying to solve different diplomatic problems, I just thought to myself, maybe negotiation is important because it's about compromising, right? So I just want to know how much is it a critical skill in diplomacy? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I think it depends a little bit on the kind of work you're doing. And if you're a bilateral diplomat, when I was in Nairobi when I was in Abuja, we did a little bit of negotiation, but a lot of the work that we did wasn't actually formal negotiation of a type that one associates with the UN, for example. But when you're trying to broker peace, or when you're sitting in a council, as I do at NATO, then the negotiation is absolutely crucial. And I suppose at the end of the day, it's all negotiation. If I'm meeting with the minister bilaterally, or if I'm leading a peace negotiation, even the bilateral discussion is a form of negotiation. Negotiation is a little bit of an art. And it's one of these things like writing speeches that most people do not do very well. And so when you see someone who is a really brilliant negotiator, you recognize the skill and the artistry. But at the end of the day, most diplomatic interaction involves negotiation of one form or another, and a lot of the multilateral diplomacy, almost everything is negotiation. My day job is basically as a negotiator representing Canada in an ongoing negotiation around peace and security in the Euro-Atlantic area.
Perfect. Lucky?
Okay, thank you. Good evening, everybody. Are you hearing me?
Yes, we do.
All right, perfect. So I appreciate the ambassador for the good speech. It was insightful. My question is, as a diplomat, I think you are like a messenger of the certain government to another government. So, and I wanted to ask, at what percentage do you represent the government, you as an individual in another government, and maybe there's some issues or some negotiations you have to address? At what percentage as an individual do you address such negotiations as you individual, without maybe regarding on the take of the government? Thanks.
Thanks, Lucky. I mean, the short answer is 100%. And you bring your own personality to the process. But I represent only the views of the Canadian government. And it's really not appropriate for me to be expressing personal views in any formal interaction that I have. And in fact, it's even more than that, in that when you are a diplomat abroad, especially if you're a senior diplomat, you're kind of always representing the government. You know, when I'm at home in Canada, I work my day job and I work hard from 8 to 7 or whatever the hours are, and then I go home and then I'm a private citizen again. And on the weekend I do what I want, and I am myself until I'm back in the office. When you're abroad, especially as an ambassador, 24/7, you are the personification of your country. So if when I'm out on the street, I'm the Canadian ambassador out on the street. I'm not David Angell going for a stroll, and that's not always welcome. It's everyone likes to have a bad hair day, and everyone likes to have some time when they're just themselves, and you don't always want to be kind of on call, but one of the characteristics or traits of this job is that you always are working when you're abroad.
Perfect answer. Always Canadian representative of countries' views. Yeah. I see Winnie, then Agustino. Dang.
Good evening, everyone.
Hi.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we do.
Okay, good evening. So thanks for the opportunity. And my question is very brief. So for someone who is interested in diplomacy and someone who wants to start a career in diplomacy, what is the first step to take? How do you get yourself out there? Thank you.
Thanks very much, Winnie. I mean, the answer depends on where you are. And diplomacy is one of those careers that only only a national government can offer on the whole. I mean, there are a little bit of diplomacy that's not formal, but not much. And every country staffs their foreign ministry differently. In Canada, it's evolved over the years. When 3 decades ago I became a diplomat, the only way you could join was through a competition, which was run each year or every 2 years. And then, if you got through that process, the expectation was that you'd spend your entire career in the foreign ministry. And then over time, it became a little bit easier to join the foreign ministry on what we call a lateral basis. In other words, come in from another government ministry or from the private sector. But there is some structured process run by a public service commission, usually, through which you enter this stream of government service. And the process, it varies from country to country, but usually the template is the same. What's different now from 30 years ago when I started is that there are more and more things that you can do that are kind of like diplomacy, but not quite diplomacy. So if you're really interested in a particular set of issues, you can work with an international non-governmental organization or a national non-governmental organization, or you can work with the UN or another international organization. And there are many more opportunities of that type than existed 30 years ago. But diplomacy is a state function, and each state has its own hiring process for its diplomats.
Thank you, David. And I think the first step is, get connected with your government, approach. Someone is saying that don't wait to be appointed, show yourself, you just show that you are in for it, and then they can start from there.
And check with your public service commission or your foreign ministry on the website. Usually they'll explain what the recruitment process is.
So, good. Agostino?
Hello?
Hello.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to begin by the previous speaker asking the ambassador on if you have interest to get into this career of diplomacy. Before I go to my question is, I have seen around the world, and I've seen, for example, in my country like South Sudan, there are a lot of diplomats here, including the Canadian embassy. And to me, I know diplomacy is about selling the idea of your country and also trying to help the people that you are in their country. And sometimes I see it's always a hard career. Yes, it's connected to issues of government, selling the idea of the government. But when it comes to issues that people now fail to understand the importance of diplomacy, as he said, during the Rwanda genocide, there are issues that, like now, this conflict in the in Myanmar, when a diplomat was in the UN trying to say that the generals should not do that, he was disowned. My question is this: when you take a career of this kind, it has to be with the dignity, with the respect, and your country should believe in you when you begin advising. Why is it most time most governments tend to disown their diplomats when things get hard because they are talking the truth? Thank you.
Thanks, Agostino. I mean that can happen. One of the tasks of the diplomat is to, when first of all, to take a step backwards. Take a step back rather. A diplomat serving abroad, at the end of the day, is a guest in the country that he or she is serving in, and you need to find a way to do your work and say what you need to say that is always respectful of the authorities that are that run the country that you're in, and respectful of the society. If you have an extreme situation, like Myanmar, you know, again, you have to find a way of conveying strong views that may not be welcome on the part of the authorities in a way that is still likely to be heard by them. And that means not just pounding the table, but actually finding a way of being listened to. And it's very hard to do that if you're not being respectful. There are a small number of cases I can think of where diplomats have not been supported by their home governments. But it really is the exception. At the end of the day, if you lose the confidence of your employer, your own government, they will usually just yank you home and fire you. You know, again, going back to an earlier question, we're always representing our government when we're abroad. And if the government doesn't have confidence in how we're doing that, then it has the prerogative to bring us home. Sometimes you've seen more drastic situations where individuals are just disowned entirely, but that's really very unusual.
Perfect. Then Salama and Joseph. Salama and Joseph.
Hi, can you hear me?
Hi.
Can you hear me, right?
Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah.
All right, great. First of all, thank you so much, Mr. David, for that. It's just amazing. It's exactly what I wanted to hear, since I have, like, you know, diplomacy has always sparked my interest. So I actually have a quick question about that. Now, basically, as you know, for example, in my country, people are not so into this. Like, they're not really so interested, or like they consider it as something that is not like something that it's like impossible to really get in. So like I was thinking of like, for example, creating a certain platform or an area or anything that can be done online, where actually we can have the chance to let this kind of youth to know more about this, about diplomacy and this diplomatic life, and how can this later lead us to, for example, solve problems and do better things, you know, since it's like, for me, it's an amazing field to really like have a chance to really know more about it. So now I was thinking like that, like, you know, creating something for them so that they can know more about that. So my question is, like, for example, if I implemented what I'm thinking about now, what the things that I can really include in that? Like, how should I start it, or what should I really include, and so on. So I hope my question was clear, and thank you so much again.
Thank you very much for the question, Sam. I think, you know, probably the easiest way to start is just to talk to diplomats in your own country. And I would have thought that most would be very happy to meet with youth, with groups. And so if you and some of your colleagues want to know more about diplomacy as it relates to whichever country you're from, then invite some of the ambassadors who are serving there to meet with you, and invite ambassadors from a variety of countries, and including from your own region, because very often the ambassadors from the region are the best informed and doing some of the most creative work. And so just talk to the people who are nearby. You can expand the scale, of course, and interact with diplomats from the broader region. But I would have thought that ambassadors, and not just ambassadors, but other members of missions, and also senior staff of UN and other international organizations who are accredited to your country, would welcome the chance to meet with youth and talk about the profession as they see it in that country. And
Yeah. You freeze David a bit.
do you want me to repeat that, or did you get most of it?
We got most of it, but
Just the ambassadors in your own country, I think, would be really pleased to meet with you and tell you about diplomacy as they see it, as practiced in your country and your region.
perfect. I hope some I got that. then Nyasha and Prince. I hope this time works around, okay? the volume. Yeah.
Yeah, I hope it works.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mr. David. It's all clear. Thank you.
Okay, Nyasha, go ahead.
Okay. I said in my question, but there's also a follow-up question. So I'm at the so I don't know if I'm now audible enough to come around.
We can't hear you for sure. So
Okay, can we read out my question?
yeah, you just type it and I read it. I'll read it. Don't worry. Type it.
I typed it. It's already there.
Oh, you typed. Okay.
Yes.
Let me read it. And hold on. Okay. Here it goes. Very long, but I'll read faster. In my country, it's all about political links to become a diplomat, but it has not killed my dream. I'm currently asking Your Excellency to help us push for youth representation and negotiation at such high diplomatic level. I hope one day we can have a youth diplomatic council where youth voice their issues at a diplomatic levels, just like the local youth parliament. World Youth Parliament. World Youth Parliament. I had the privilege to speak at the African Forum for Sustainable Development last year, and we pushed for the UN Youth Council. It gained so much momentum until COVID-19 happened. Like Kofi Annan rightfully puts it, youth are not mere subjects of policing, but they are active agents of change. You can invite me at your platform so I can make a presentation on the issue. That's it. Did you hear it, David?
I heard it, and I think that's a very fair comment. And certainly, for my own Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, amplifying youth voices is an enormously important objective. And very often, when he travels, he makes a point of trying to reach out to youth in the country he's visiting. And a lot of governments are working harder and harder to amplify youth voices. And sometimes the UN agencies in a country will have structured processes to reach out to youth. And sometimes some of the embassies will make a real point of reaching out to groups. So again, a little bit like Selma's question, I think you'll find that quite a lot of people are very keen to hear what you have to say. And even if not every government is making youth representation a priority, many are, and many organizations are, and there should be a means for you to tap in through that.
Perfect. Thank you. I have another question in the chat. My question is from Nelson Mandela. My question is there will be some challenges, always diplomatic challenges and family challenges. How do you balance in between?
How do you balance the family challenges?
How do you balance diplomatic challenges and family, challenges? I guess.
Yeah, it's hard. I have a 23-year-old and a 20-year-old, and they've grown up. My son was saying that he's now living in his 8th country, and it can be incredibly enriching on the one hand, but it can also be very challenging. And sometimes it's just a question of where a child is at a particular stage in his or her life, and 13-year-olds, for example, are very hard to move under the best of circumstances. It's a difficult age, but kids can have a fantastic experience living abroad at one stage in their life and then find it more difficult. And part of the challenge for diplomat parents, and we don't all get this right, is to try to move at times that work for the kids. And as I say, sometimes we get it right, And you know, it can be incredibly enriching, but it's something you always have to think about. Then you also have challenges at the other end with aging parents. And you know, sometimes you reach a stage in life as a member of a family where you just want to be home providing care, but the job doesn't necessarily allow you to do that. And then increasingly, you've got challenges on the spousal front as well. You know, in many countries, certainly in Canada, usually both partners work. The economy increasingly assumes that both members work, but for the spouse, it can be very hard to maintain a career if every 2 or 3 years you're kind of pulled out of the place that you're working. My spouse Kate is a teacher, and she's actually found this career to be enormously enriching, but that's in part because teaching is a much more mobile career than many others. If she were, you know, if she were a real estate agent in Canada, and that's a career where you really have to be deeply rooted in the community that you're working in, she couldn't have maintained her career. So it has to make sense as a career for the family, and you'd have to be really sensitive to the needs of the kids as they evolve. But even with all the sensitivity in the world, you're not going to get it right all the time, because kids go through such different stages as they're growing up. And if they're in the right place, it's fantastic. If in the wrong place, it really isn't.
Thank you. Yabanish? Hello, Yabanish, your time. I see your hand up.
Sorry, I was still unmuting. Okay, thank you very much, Ambassador David. That was a great insight, and thanks for sharing your experience. So my question is, I mean, there is evidence that Africa is underrepresented in most of international organizations. Let's say in World Trade Organization, the entire continent has only 3% share. World Bank, when it comes to giving our opinion, or Africa's part is less compared to other developed countries. So what is missing with African diplomats and representatives while representing our continent and countries? I mean, it's a continent, it's not a country, but where most of African representatives present their country, what is missing, what is lacking, and what is your advice for young African diplomats? How do we change that? How do we represent our countries more, and how can we have our voices heard more, our influences increase? Thank you.
There are two different types of answers one could pursue. One is African representation in the leadership of international organizations. And there's real progress that's being made there. You've got Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, who is phenomenal as the new Director General of the World Trade Organization. You've got Amina Mohammed, also phenomenal, who's the Deputy Secretary General of the UN, and they're both from just one country, from Nigeria. You've got other people in positions of leadership across the UN system. And that's just a question of you know, making sure that the most senior and capable leaders from your respective countries rather keep chasing after these international jobs. You know, it's a hugely complex process. Staffing the DG position at WTO took 2 or 3 years with some superb candidates. But Ngozi, who I know fairly well from my time in Nigeria, you know, just persevered, and she is the first woman, the first African to head this incredibly important organization. The other question that's harder to answer is about Africa's place in the governance of the organization. So not the individuals leading it, but the machinery, the councils, the vote wielding roles. And that's a much more difficult question, in part because in many ways the governance of international organizations still reflects a snapshot from the period when those organizations were created. If if you look at the UN Security Council, for example, it's bigger than it was when it was established, but not much bigger. And the last, there was a slight increase back in the 1960s, and otherwise it's been frozen. And Africa has an entirely legitimate argument that it is making about its unique underrepresentation amongst the permanent members. The challenge with the UN Security Council, if a solution could be found, if Africa's underrepresentation could be isolated from the other broader questions of governance, then I think you'd find a consensus to fix that fairly quickly. The challenge is that you can't isolate the Africa piece from the broader piece. And so, in a world where the Japanese and the Indians and the Brazilians want a permanent seat, and you've got disagreements around the veto, and you've got underrepresentation of many regions, we are now in, I think, the second decade of trying to fix this and not making much progress. But the African argument is more straightforward, and if we could find a way of just dealing with that and putting the rest aside, I think we would fix that in an instant for the Security Council. In other, I get the answer varies from organization to organization. You've got a very particular issue in the World Bank, the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development Group. And there, I'm not a specialist, but the successive U.S. governments have had a very strong view on reopening the governance. Again, not for reasons to do with Africa, but because you then get the balance of power within the organization shifts. And again, if you could separate out the African piece, I think you could solve it in the World Bank too. But these are enormously complicated questions. You can't isolate a particular region. Once you reopen the governance, you've sort of got you've got everything in play, and countries are very, very conscious of a dynamic where they could lose influence. So the countries that have the most are most worried about losing that. And it's already a situation where you got China, you've got Brazil, you've got some very big countries that are pushing for a greater say on their part. And so the African voice is sometimes drowned out by that piece too.
Thank you so much, David. There's the person, Prince. You raised your hand, but it kept on going off and on. Prince, you hear me? You can share your question.
Okay, right now I can hear you.
Okay.
Please have a good evening, and thanks for the opportunity. I want to use the opportunity to congratulate the presenter for his insightful presentation. Going forward, the question I wanted to ask is the exact question the lady asked with regards to Africa's representation in world organizations. But in answering the question, I realized that the presenter actually did not tackle the answer as I was expecting. So if there is complexity surrounding the issue, what should the African child or the African youth who is growing up and have interest in diplomacy, what path is he supposed to take in order to improve or to be able to increase Africa's participation in the institution, as in the world institutions? What is our take? What should we do? I want him to give us a roadmap, as in how we can also fight for us to be included in running the world institutions. Thank you.
Well, I mean, part of that is by, I mean, thanks for the question, Prince. Part of it is simply by developing your own capacity to lead. I mean, the more Ngozi Okonjo-Iwealas that Africa produces, the more Amina J. Mohammed that Africa produces, the more very senior Africans you will have running these organizations. And there is an increasingly important representation of Africa amongst the heads of UN agencies. And you've had Boutros Ghali, you've had Kofi Annan, you've had Africans running the UN system itself. And Ngosi's success in becoming the DG of the WTO is a really big deal. I mean, this is an organization that has never been run by a woman, never been run by an African. She is really charting a hugely important path here. The governance piece, though, there is, the international community does not know how to fix this problem. Not the Africa piece, but the broader piece. How do you change the composition of the UN Security Council in a way that allows for underrepresented regions to have a greater voice, but that is still acceptable to the P5 who have a veto on any change? We have been discussing this for 20 years or longer, actually for 30 years, because no one has been able to identify the diplomatic solution. So, there has to be a solution. There was a temporary solution in the 1960s, increasing the number of elected members. But the way forward can just as readily be found by an academic from Africa or a diplomat from Africa as it can from, by a Canadian or someone from Japan or Venezuela. It's not that people don't want to see these governance challenges resolved. We just have not collectively, as an international community, found a solution that is acceptable to the people who need to agree. And so throw yourself into that.
Thank you. Throw yourself into that. I like the last piece. You have to go for it. Okay, I think there are no questions, and we just about to end. I'll ask David to give, one more question, only one. Priska?
Thank you. I have a question. First of all, I want to greet you all. Good evening. And I have this question, which is saying about diplomacy. As we know from the definition of diplomacy, it's kind of a method of that influencing the decisions and the behavior of the foreign government, and whereby this has to be done through dialogues or negotiation. So now I have this question whereby we have this youth. It's kind of a challenge that you have among the youth, because from the title is saying that the youth, the diplomacy that boosts the youth. Now you find that we are having these youth, these young people who are saying that if you want Africa to rebirth, this will take like 400 years or like 100 years for Africa to be like other developed countries or like other developed continents. So I have this question, which is a big challenge for us, the youth. How can you push those people to understand that diplomacy, it's not just about having that title of being there as the ambassador or the mayor or something else, because they are there saying that look at the people who are there, like the president or the ministers or those people who represent us. They are not doing anything, so they are like, why should I go there? I want to save my skin. So the challenge is bringing them back so that we can work together. But the thing is, they don't understand. So what method can we use so that we bring them together and then bring a strong Africa, and then like putting them into a situation that they will understand that diplomacy is not just something that is there to just having a title, but the diplomacy is just to bring like this relationship among other states. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Priska. I mean, at the end of the day, diplomacy is just countries talking to each other. And, I think increasing the youth voice within that, in part, the answer has to be within the countries themselves. So that, as Canada often does, there is youth representation and delegations to international meetings. In part, part of the answer is in the organization of those meetings. so that there is profile given, space given for young voices, as I think happens more and more at global meetings. Part of the answer is making sure that the agenda of the meetings takes on issues that matter to youth. And so you've had the UN Security, for example, looking at youth and peace and security recently, and that's a big step. The specifically African piece, and part of it's incumbent on every government to include youth in their delegations. It's not just youth, also to include women, to make sure that societies are as representative as are as well represented as possible in the diplomatic process. And I mentioned the Abuja negotiations on Darfur that I was part of 15 or 20 years ago. One of the contributions that Canada made was to provide financial support to the AU so that it could not only bring gender experts, but also support the political movements and even the governments in making sure that women were included on their delegations and were part of the negotiation. And if we were doing that now, 15, 20 years later, we would probably press for youth to be included as well. Because of, in the case of Darfur, a case of a peace negotiation, the outcome is only going to take hold if the communities that are most affected are part of the negotiation, and the involvement of women is crucial to that, and the involvement of youth is crucial to that. Going back to how Africa can amplify its voice, apart from generating more Ngozis and people of that caliber, Africa, more than, in my experience, and I've worked on African issues for about 20 years, including in a multilateral context. One thing that Africa does better than any other region is leverage numbers. And so there are 53 or 54 African countries, depending on whether depending on whether you're looking at UN members or not, and whether you're looking at the AU list. Anyway, it's a large number, and Africa, historically, in my experience, is much better than any other region, more disciplined in bringing the weight of those numbers to bear. And so when you have 53 votes and they're coordinated in support of a particular candidate, that really counts for something in multilateral diplomacy. When you've got 53 or 54 votes in support or not of a particular resolution, that really counts. And so, Africa is in many international meetings is not underrepresented. It's extremely effectively represented by very effective diplomats who coordinate. 53 or 54 votes is generally enough to make or break any outcome. So sometimes you see real strength in the African representation.
Thank you. I guess we are wrapping up, and everyone, I guess, learned something from diplomacy, because like most people thought that diplomacy just running governments, signing meetings, but there are traits to it, and I guess Ambassador David brought it very well in his 8 characteristics of questions. I'll ask Ambassador David to have his conclusive remarks. What's the best package you can talk to these young leaders as we wrap up? You're muted.
Sorry, I thought I unmuted. I guess my closing thought would really be to encourage you to look closely at diplomacy as a career. Some of you have talked about some of the constraints that exist now and some of the barriers that you see. But when I look back at this profession over 30 years, it really has changed. And if I look at the evolution of diplomacy in my own country, it's constantly changing. If you go back, I've been doing this for 30 years. If you take the time I started and work back 30 years from then, it used to be that diplomacy was a career you could only be part of if you were independently wealthy. I mean, the salary was virtually non-existent. You were expected to be able to pay your own way. And somebody with my background, it just wouldn't have been an option. But it's changed. It's been professionalized. And part of the professionalization part of the change I see in the professionalization over the past 5, 10, 15 years is it's becoming a much more representative profession in terms of the entirety of our societies. When I look at the Canadian representation 30 years ago, it was a bunch of white guys of a certain age. If I look at it now, the entire diversity of Canadian society is represented in our diplomatic community. And so, it's a more conservative profession than others. It's a harder profession than others to reconcile with family life. We talked about that a little bit. But it's changing. It's becoming much more representative. Don't be intimidated, I guess is what I'm trying to say. We need energy. We need new ideas, new approaches. I'm seeing that in Canada as well. It used to be, just lawyers and just political scientists who were hired. Now people from incredibly varied backgrounds are being hired because the global issues we're trying to address are incredibly varied. So it's a demanding career, but incredibly interesting, and it needs a stronger African voice, and it needs youth. And so throw yourselves into it.
Thank you so much, Ambassador David. We very much appreciative for your time and for speaking to young leaders across. And they are made by your wise counsel, and when they hear such incredible experience of over 30 years in diplomacy, I think you're the best person to advise the young people stepping, even those who aren't considering it as a career, or those who are considering it as a lifetime career. They are gonna change. I think there's something be posted in their mind. Just in case you didn't write down the 8 characteristics that Ambassador David said, one of them, as we conclude, one of them is judgment. You must have ability to judge what's better or what's good, what works. Creativity. Creativity is even in our own lives, in our own lifestyle. You must be creative to succeed. Discipline is everything. Accountability, discipline. Communication and ability to speak. You must articulate your own issues, and have the ability to bring them, people to listen. Empathy. This is actually shocked me. Empathy, diplomacy, then empathy. So you must be empathetic in all hard issues dealing. Then resilience. Resilience is something very important. It works across even a doctor, even a lawyer, even a politician. You need resilience to succeed. Then independence of the mind. This is also very crucial that you draft your own decision. So I argue all young leaders on the platform to have this, let's develop more tactics on how to, to scale up our leadership skills, even if you're in business, even if you're planning to be in politics, let's, embrace these characteristics. So thank you very much, Ambassador David. We are so grateful, and we call it a day today. And thank you so much for everyone who attended, contribution, wise questions, counsels. Let's, put it up to our social media and continue the debate and the conversation. So thank you very much, David. I know it's a weekend, and we want to let you go and have a restful weekend. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, Enoch, and thank you to everyone. Thank you for your questions. It's a real pleasure having a chance to interact with you, and good luck with the rest of the series.
Thank you. Thank you.